Good morning and welcome everyone. It's great to be back with you. I've so much enjoyed this series on the Bible and poverty. I've enjoyed getting to know you. Your comments and your insights into this topic have been amazing, and I am honored to be with you all. This is week 3 of what is a 6-week series where we are doing an in-depth dive into what Scripture has to say about poverty, economic injustice, and matters related to what I'll call community development, or the way to nurture communities where there is wholeness and justice in the economic realm. In our previous week, last week, we turned to the topic of poverty and the law, and we began getting a sense of the ways in which a concern for economic well-being really is at the heart of the law. The law is not just concerned about archaic rituals of sacrifice and worship, but very central to the law is this idea of flourishing communities, communities where everyone has access to what they need to exist and to flourish, both socially, religiously, and economically. And we got a closer look at some of those practices, from the triennial tithe to the law about not harvesting or reaping to the edge of your field, to even this practice of every 1 in 7 years leaving your field unharvested for the sake of the poor. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight that was implicit last week is that the law occupies this middle space in terms of the practices it recommends between, I think, what many modern churches feel are its only opportunities for poverty relief. And that is, in my experience with churches, we feel like we can either do individual acts of charity, like soup kitchens or food pantries, or we can lobby at the governmental level for nationwide change, laws that really begin to change the system of economics in our country. And those two options are both valid. We can do soup kitchens and food pantries and individual acts of charity. We can lobby, but I find that churches only gravitate to those two things, that sometimes the lobbying feels too daunting, or we don't know how to do it. But maybe we're aware that our food pantries and soup kitchens aren't making the sort of sustainable, transformative impact that we hope that they would. And here's where the law I find to be incredibly powerful. Almost all of the principles and practices named in the law occupy some middle space between those two things. That is to say, the law is trying to mobilize and orient local communities to do things that make a real and sustaining difference. It takes community practice, so it's bigger than the food pantry or the soup kitchen or individual acts of charity, but it's not exactly a national program that involves governmental changes to laws. People are finding agency and empowerment at a local level to make a difference in how poverty exists and what poverty is like at a local level. And friends, if I had to sum up where we've been so far, that's the space that I'm inviting you as a church to begin to think about, to move beyond the individual acts of charity. I'm not saying don't do advocacy at a governmental level. You may wish to do that, you may not. That is certainly a valid option and can be an effective option, but there's so much in between those two things. And that's where a lot of the focus of our scriptures are. How, as local communities, can we think holistically about poverty relief and addressing the issues that cause poverty in the first place? So friends, that's where we've been so far as we've dug into the topic of poverty and the law. This morning, we're going to keep going canonically as we move through the Old Testament, and we're going to turn to the question of poverty and the prophets. Now, the prophets are sort of the go-to place for many people when they have conversations about any matters of justice, let alone economic justice. And indeed, the prophets have some stirring and evocative things to say about economics and economic justice. And so we're going to dig into that this morning. Again, we can't be exhaustive. Had this been a 36-week course, we could really get into a lot of the details. That's a bit long, I think, for this sort of course. But what I want to do is give you some frameworks and footholds for understanding how the prophetic witness addresses the issue of economic impoverishment. So friends, that's where we're headed today. Let me offer a word of prayer, and then we will dive right in. Sound good? All right, please pray with me this morning. God of shalom, God of mercy, God of grace, we are grateful to be gathered as congregants, as leaders, as friends, as folks who want to make a difference in this world that you love so much. Lord, may you inspire us and challenge us and convict us to dream and hope and labor and live our lives in a way that will make a difference in this world, especially for those who so often go without the basic things of life. We pray that you would encourage us and guide us through this conversation. We pray all this in your name. Amen. All right, friends, let me go ahead and do the weekly gymnastics of sharing my screen. Fingers crossed that we can get this to work. All right, did that come through? You can see my slides, yes? It's almost as if I'm starting to know what I'm doing. Almost, friends. All right, here's where we want to start. I want to raise the question, just as we begin to orient ourselves to the prophets, is what exactly is a prophet? Like, what's a prophetic job description? What's the job description of a prophet in the ancient world? Or maybe better yet, what images come to mind of what a prophet looks like? Well, one popular image from popular
slide is, I'm sorry, your slide is small. Oh, no, it didn't.
There it is. Yeah, sorry. I was just one click away. That's a metaphor for me sometimes, being one click behind. But there we are. So I think in popular Christian and in religious imagination, sometimes we think of the prophets as diviners, people whose job it is to tell the future. And here I have a picture, of course, if you have little ones, grandkids or kids, you'll know that this is Professor Trelawney from the Harry Potter series. She's sort of a future fortune teller of sorts, kind of an interesting figure. And this is how many of us understand the prophets. They predict the future, particularly they predict aspects of Jesus's coming life and ministry. And in fact, this is so deeply intertwined into popular culture that if you look up the word prophetic in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the definition it gives is a prophetic means to accurately predict what will happen in the future. Accurately predict what will happen in the future. So that's one image of what a prophet is. Another popular image of what a prophet is a fiery preacher. A fiery preacher, you know, that preacher, that old-timey preacher that preaches hellfire and brimstone. I saw a church sign the other day in rural Georgia that said, "This is a KJV hellfire and brimstone preaching church." And presumably that was meant to attract people to the church. I'm not sure exactly that would attract me to church participation, but nevertheless, there's this idea that the prophets were these fiery, maybe even street preachers. Their job was to lead religious reform and religious revival by calling people to repent and be saved. In my experience, these two images are the images that most people have when they think of the biblical prophets. And while there are aspects of both of these that are true, they also both, I think, significantly miss the mark when it comes to the role and function of prophets in the biblical world. And let me ask you this, actually. What do you think these two images miss? What do they leave out that's important for what prophets were and what they did? What do these two images not capture for us quite well enough? What do y'all think?
They leave out God.
Okay, yeah, they leave out God explicitly. Now, maybe that's implied in the fiery preacher, but maybe not. So I like that. It leaves out God. What else does it miss?
Well, are they telling the truth about what is happening now?
Very good. They are truth tellers, but the truth that they talk about often and almost always has to do with the present moment. They're not so much predicting the future as they are reflecting on what is happening in the present moment. And I think this is something that at least the image on the left, the Professor Trelawney figure, misses. They are less fortune tellers or future tellers than they are social critics. And so what I'm going to offer is this very brief definition that the prophets are religiously oriented or maybe faith rooted social critics. That is, they are deeply aware of social and I would add economic realities on the ground in the places they lived. and they are bringing their faith traditions to bear on those real contextual social realities that are happening in history. The image that comes to mind for me comes from Karl Barth, a great reformed thinker from the 20th century. And Karl Barth had this idea of the preacher as someone with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in another hand. The Bible in one hand and newspaper in another hand. Now, we would probably have to update that image today to say something like the Bible in one hand and the tablet in the other, or the social media feed or something like that. But what Barth was trying to capture is that the prophetic preacher is someone who is deeply aware of the contextual and social realities of where they are embedded, of the world, of their local community, and they are bringing scripture to bear on that social reality. They're creating a conversation, and one is informing, or the scriptural witness is informing how one lives and acts and labors for justice and transformation in the midst of real social contexts. And I think that's what some of these popular images of the prophet misses. So the prophets in the ancient world, they didn't have scripture as we know it today, but they did have the law. So the principles that we talked about and some of the practices that we outlined last week, in some form or another, we believe that the prophets had access to that material. Now, it might not have been in a completed book of Genesis or a completed book of Deuteronomy, but the traditions and the ideas that we now find in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, we believe most of them were present to the prophets. It's something the prophets had access to. So in place of the Bible in one hand, newspaper in the other, we might say that the prophets had the Torah, the law, and were bringing those laws to bear on what they knew about what was happening in the here and now in ancient Israel. So that's sort of a brief orientation to how we're going to begin to think about the prophets. Now, if that's who prophets are, and if that's what prophets did, then what is key for us this morning is to begin to understand, A, what were the social realities that the prophets were addressing? So if they are social critics that are deeply informed by the law and the religious tradition, and they're bringing that tradition to bear on social realities, what were the social realities? What do we need to understand about what was happening in ancient Israel to really understand what the prophets were all about? So that's the first thing. What's the social context in which they existed? And then the second is, how did they respond? What were some of the general tasks and objectives of the prophetic response to that social reality? So what was the social reality, and how did the prophets begin to respond? That's what I want to flesh out for us in a little bit more detail this morning. Now, before I do so, let me just pause to see if there are any questions so far about how we're beginning to describe what a prophet is and how a prophet works. Yeah, go ahead, Reynolds.
Ron, if the prophet is supposedly religiously oriented and is, I guess the Webster defines it as accurately predicting the future, wouldn't they have to have some credibility as a prophet before, they're defined as a prophet? I mean, a street preacher, can stand up on the corner, but only he can call himself a prophet unless he has some credibility.
Sure.
And who defines whether someone is a prophet or not? Is it the church? You would think if they're holding up a Bible, it would call for the church, and it would also imply that they have been religiously selected to give this future information. I don't know. That's this. I'd see it as a confounding paradox between the church and the street preacher.
Sure. No, I think these are all good questions, and just a couple of quick responses to them. There was a sense in ancient Israel that part of the credibility of a prophet did hinge on whether their words rang true, whether their words came true. Now, again, knowing that they weren't really doing far off future prediction, a lot of the credibility had to do with, do they understand the social context? Are they bringing to bear the biblical witness to that reality in a credible thoughtful way. So that's part of it. But the other thing that gives credibility to the prophets, which is very interesting, is that if you look in the Old Testament, we encounter a number of different prophetic call narratives, these instances where God calls a prophet to the task of prophecy, right? We don't have it for every prophet, but we think that it probably happened in the case of every prophet. And what's interesting is that prophets always resist their call. They always resist their call. We see it with Moses. We see it get worked out again and again in different circumstances. And part of the function of that resistance is actually about their credibility, right? Because it enables them to say, I'm not doing this on my own ambition. So Cindy's being called to be a prophet, and she says, no, I don't think this is right for me. That actually lends credibility to her, because now we're not thinking, oh, Cindy's doing this for her own gain or out of her own ambition. It validates, her resistance validates that this is an irresistible call from God, and that God is truly behind it. Because I think the idea here in the ancient world is that no person, apart from an irresistible call from God, would want to be a prophet. Because prophets were troublemakers, in good troublemakers, to borrow John Lewis's terminology. They spoke truth to power, and that made them not popular. So if you wanted to have a bunch of powerful, influential friends, don't be a prophet in the ancient world, because you stirred up good trouble with those groups. So Reynolds, that's only a partial response to your question, but I hope that helps begin to orient.
It does, thanks.
Yeah. Anything else before we jump in further on this? We're good? Yeah, Jim, go ahead. I think you're still on mute there, Jim. Your unmute should be on the bottom of your screen, bottom center, or the space bar also unmutes you. There you go. Oh, there.
I'm sorry. I actually know. Right. I'm sorry. I know how to work Zoom, but I just sort of totally forgot for 1 second. Yeah. In the ancient world, would someone be known specifically as a prophet? Like Amos is a prophet. Would they use that word, and would there be sort of an election to be prophet? Mm-hmm. Not literally an election, but how would that recognition come about if they really were known as prophets?
Yeah, gosh, these are such good questions. It would be so fun to have a 6-week course on the prophets to really dig into this. But again, a quick answer would be, we seem to think that the biblical evidence suggests that there were schools of prophets in the ancient world. So you would sort of like, Elijah or Elisha or someone like that would actually have a group of mentees, if you will, a group of people who were trained in the prophetic tradition. And I think by association with major prophetic figures, you also gained credibility or gained the title prophet. Now, what's interesting is that the word prophet, and there's a good Hebrew word for prophet, it's navi, that's actually not always the word used to describe prophets. Prophets are sometimes just referred to as men of God or women of God. So they're sort of recognized for their spiritual density or their spiritual centeredness. And the term prophet that we use is it's used, but we have made that more popular, or at least that's not the only way that the prophets were defined. In fact, one of the words for prophets in the Old Testament, rose, means seer. Seer, S-E-E-R, and that it doesn't so much mean like someone who can see the future, but someone who can see the present more clearly than the rest. They can see to the real, they can look behind the veil of the present reality and see what's wrong and see what's really happening. And I think that's a nice orientation to the idea of a prophet. All right, friends, great stuff. Let me move us forward. And what I want to begin to do is just talk about what's happening on the ground in ancient Israel. What is that social reality that the prophets are addressing? Now, this is a complicated question because the prophets, most broadly defined, span about 700 years in biblical history, from about the 9th century BCE all the way down to the 2nd century BCE. And there's not just one single static social reality that the prophets focus on. A lot of things change in the course of that time. So again, this is where we really need a 6-week course to cover this adequately. But what I want to do is I want to bring us to the 8th century. And the reason we're turning to the 8th century is that's really when we begin to see prophetic activity in ancient Israel increase. In fact, the 8th century is really still considered the height of prophetic activity throughout that 700-year span. So the 8th century offers a really good test case for thinking about the social reality, because that's when prophetic activity is on the rise. This, by the way, is where we get the books from Isaiah, Amos, Hosea, Micah, and probably bits and pieces of the other prophets also come from the 8th century. So this is a nice period to turn to. It's not exhaustive, but I want to give you one example. And what I want to offer this morning, friends, is that the fact that the prophetic activity is on the rise in the 8th century is not an accident. It's not just circumstantial or coincidental, is what the word I was looking for, that the prophets begin to be very active during this period. Stuff is happening in Israel's social world that demands a prophetic response. And there's 2 things I want to highlight for you, only one of which we'll dig into deeply. The first thing that's happening that requires a prophetic response is that in the 8th century, ancient Israel is experiencing a serious geopolitical threat from a rising power to the north. Does anyone remember, this is our Bible trivia for the morning, what rising geopolitical power in the north becomes a threat for Israel in the 8th century?
Assyria.
Assyria, exactly. It's the Babylonians later, but in the 8th century, it's Assyria. They are sweeping across what we would call the Middle East, taking over places, exiling people, and basically they are the major superpower on the geopolitical stage. And ancient Assyria is making incursions into northern Israel. And ultimately by 721, so the last quarter of the 8th century, the northern 10 tribes, often called Israel, falls to Assyria. So this is a major threat, and the prophets have things to say about the coming threat of Assyria, why it's happening, and what Israel can do about it. That's out there. But interestingly enough, the major prophetic concern is not with the external power of Assyria. The major prophetic concern is with something that's happening internal to Israel, and it has to do with the land and land distribution and economics. And this is the part that I want to that's most salient for our purposes, but often gets left out, I think, of sermons and Sunday school series. We miss this social reality, but it's so important for understanding the 8th century prophets. So let me unpack it a little bit for you. And I have to tell a little bit of a history here. So prior to the 8th century, the way that ancient Israel worked economically is, and I think I've mentioned this before in this course, but primarily everyone was subsistence farmers. Right? We all had a plot of land. Tom had his land. Emily had her land. Julie had hers land. We all were subsistence farmers. We grew a variety of staple crops that enabled us to feed our extended families and survive. With any luck, we would have a little bit left over, a little bit of surplus that we could store up in the case of a drought or a famine, or maybe we could trade small bits of it for, whether clothing or tools or other things that we needed that we didn't produce in our own land. And the way this economy of subsistence worked, and the way it could work, is that everyone owned this small plot of land called a nahalah. And the nahalah was something that was passed down from generation to generation. It always stayed within the family. It was not something that could be bought or sold. So there were no ancient Israelite realtors. Sorry to say, if you were a realtor, that profession was not existed because they didn't believe in buying and selling land. You had land, and Charlie and Martha's land was passed on to their kids and their kids and their kids. And in an ancient agrarian society, if you had access to land, to the nahalah, you had a means of survival and even a means of flourishing. So land access and this idea of the nahalah was really, really important. These were small plots of land, but everyone had access to a nahalah. Are you with me so far? Okay, now here's the big thing that happens in the 8th century. Steadily, and actually quite rapidly in the 8th century, what we see is that these small nahalah began to be purchased. And remember, there wasn't an idea of buying and selling land, but some of the wealthy elite, if you will, of the ancient world began to purchase nahala. And they began joining the nahalot, that's the plural in Hebrew. They began joining nahalots of various areas together to form these larger estates. So instead of having individual nahala, let's say there's, I don't know how many people are on here, let's say 25, instead of all 25 of us having our individual nahala, one wealthy landowner comes in, purchases all of our nahalot together, and forms out of what were once individual plots of land, a larger estate. So Jim no longer owns his plot, Tom no longer owns his, Eleanor no longer owns hers. It's all owned by, let's say, Larry. Larry, you're going to be our wealthy landowner for the purposes of this exercise. So Larry now owns all of this, and Eleanor and Tom and Jim, they no longer have nahala. We actually see this in the archaeological record. We see these larger estates, and the reason you can see them archaeologically is that what the landowner would do is then start building a wall enclosing the whole territory. So now a wall encloses all 25 of the nahala that he possesses. This is such a fun word, I have to teach it to you. The scholarly academic word for this process of forming large estates is latifundialization. Isn't that such a delicious word? Latifundialization. And it comes from a Latin word latifundi, which simply means large estate. So latifundialization is the creation of large estates. This is what's happening for the first time in ancient Israel in the 8th century. And it begins to completely change the economic arrangements of the land. So let's think about this together. When Larry begins to form his large estate, sorry, Larry, you're going to be that person this morning. What changes in the economy? Let's think about the effects of this on the average everyday person. So let's first think about what is grown. Okay, so now that you have these large estates, what do you grow in a large estate in comparison to what individuals would have grown in their small nahala? How does it change what you grow? What do y'all think?
Grow what you can sell.
You grow what you can sell. That is exactly right. There's a switch from staple crops, so just the stuff you need. You know, a few olives, a few grapes, you have grain. You have some root vegetables, but now when you have a large estate, your goal is different, right? Your goal is to bring your crop to market, to bring it into to make money with it. So you begin to produce cash crops. Now, in the ancient world, a cash crop primarily were grapes and olives for making wine and olive oil. They were the major cash crops, in the ancient world. So that's one shift. Now, what's the goal? The goal of our small nahala is subsistence, right? It's just enough. Julie needs just enough to survive, or Eve needs just enough for her family. What's the goal of a large estate?
To make money.
To make money, right? And because Larry, his 25 nahalot are going to produce way more than what he personally needs and his family needs to survive. So the goal of the large estates is not subsistence, but is surplus. It's building up, it's maximizing surplus so that you can trade and turn that into money and profits and cash, right? So the goal of the large estate is building up surplus. Now that should start sending alarm bells in your head, because who does that sound like? Whose economy was all about building up surplus?
Egypt.
Yes, this is Pharaoh's economy. Egypt, though liberated from Egypt, let me try that again. Israel, though liberated from Egypt, is now recreating Egypt-like economic reality. So sorry, I'm going to have to do this to you, Larry, but Larry is now Pharaoh-like. He's a little Pharaoh in that he's creating this economic system where it's all about building up surplus. And in fact, again, it's amazing we can see this in the archaeological record, but you can actually see in the 8th century, more and more little storehouses popping up within these larger estates because they needed now a place to store all of the surplus they were extracting from the land. Now, finally, what's the result? Well, the result of all of this we would say this in our terms, is a widening wealth gap. The folks like Larry who own the large estates, they get wealthier and wealthier because they are maximizing profits with their cash crops. They are taking up surplus and then they are transitioning that surplus, or they're trading that surplus for luxury goods, for money, for larger houses, etc. So Larry benefits greatly from this system. But here's the thing. Everyone else is negatively affected in a severe way, because now, instead of having a farm that you own and can have subsistence on, once you give up your nahala, you are then almost destined to become low wage workers on Larry's field. Right. And since Larry, I owe you like a gift card on the side of this. I'm making Larry up. This is not about Larry. This is the ancient Israelite Larry. So he's trying to maximize profits. And so he's not paying Cindy a wonderful wage to work his field. Like, he is maximizing profits. And so it's almost slave labor to do this. Cindy, you had a question. Go ahead.
Well, you may be getting to this, so I might be jumping ahead because I've been worrying about the people who were displaced while you were talking.
Yeah.
Why would they give up their nahala? What instead of just the initial cash they might accrue? What would be their incentive?
Yeah, great question. And the fact is, they probably didn't willingly give up their nahala. There's a great story about this in 1 Kings 21, where there's this king Ahab. And his wife is Jezebel, who's a well-known sort of villain, if you will. Ahab is a villain too. And Ahab has a field and has his royal palace in Samaria, this beautiful verdant area in the middle of Israel, or Palestine now. And he sees a field of this man named Naboth. And he comes to Naboth and he wants to acquire Naboth's nahala. And he offers Naboth fair market value for this. He says, in fact, I will give you a better field somewhere else if you take this field, or I'll give you a surplus of money for your field. And Naboth is utterly confused because he doesn't have this idea of buying and selling property. He knows that if he gave up his nahala, like, it doesn't matter how much money he would get. Like, nothing, almost no amount of money could adequately meet his needs apart from having a nahala. So Naboth says, forget it. Like, this is not happening. King Ahab and Queen Jezebel then come up with a scheme to basically kill Naboth. They trump up charges against him. They say that he cursed God and the king, which he didn't. Then they brought him to city council. He gets a capital punishment. They kill him and they take his field. So in that, I think that's a representative example, not necessarily that happened in every single case, but the evidence suggests that nahala typically were taken by force rather than just, bought up in the way we understand real estate today. So most people did not have the power to resist the expansion of these latifunди in the ancient world.
Thank you.
So let's take an example. Let's take a look at this. There are a number of passages. This is one of those places where if you go back, this is, we're going to skip this, but this is the Naboth's vineyard in more detail. This will be in the slides if you want to visit it. But let me take you to another text. I want to take you to the Song of the Vineyard in Isaiah 5. This is one of those cases, friends, where if between this Sunday and next, you were to go back and read all of the prophets, which I just assume you all will do in the week ahead, you will see this issue of land and land acquisition. It's going to jump off the page to you. It's one of those things that we've read through the prophets before. Remember that discussion we had of the hidden gorilla and the selective vision, where because we weren't told to look for it, we never saw it. This stuff is going to jump off the page at you now that you are aware of it. And one of those places is Isaiah 5, 1 through 7. It's this famous passage known as the Song of the Vineyard. And in the first couple of verses, there's this metaphor that gets played out where God is the vintner, or God is the vineyard owner, and Israel is the vineyard. And the poetry is beautiful. It shows how God planted this vineyard and cared for it. But then because of the waywardness of Israel, God tears down the walls and the hedges of the vineyard and allow the vineyard to come to ruin. And so it's this evocative metaphor of punishment that the prophets use, but it actually is much more specific than this evocative metaphor. And we get a sense of that here in Isaiah 5:7-10. Listen to the language, friends. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. So like here, the metaphor is being explained. And the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. God expected justice, but he saw bloodshed. God expected righteousness, but he heard a cry. Now, here's the key verse. This is latifundialization. Ah, you who join house to house and field to field. This is exactly what we describe. It's joining Nahala to Nahala in latifundialization. Ah, you who join house to house and field to field, until there is room for no one but you. You are squeezing the regular person out of their land. There's no room for no one but you, and you are left to live alone in the midst of the land. The Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing, surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without habitation. For 10 acres of a vineyard shall yield but one bath, and a homer of seed shall yield a mere ephah. This is specifically targeting this process of latifundialization. And a couple things just to point out in this language, which is incredible. Look at verse 7, where he says he expected justice, but he saw bloodshed, righteousness, but a cry. This is describing that this economic reality created by latifundialization is in contrast to God's justice and God's righteousness. God expected justice and righteousness from his people, but what he got instead was bloodshed and a cry. And there's this wonderful, it's evocative language in English, but there's these beautiful plays on word in Hebrew. The word for justice is mishpat. The word for bloodshed is mispach. So God expected mishpat, but got mispach. Same thing with righteousness and a cry. There's another wonderful play on word. Righteousness is tzedakah. Cry is sa'aka. So God expected tzedakah, but instead God received sa'aka, probably here referring to the cry of the poor who have to cry out to God because they have been deprived economically due to this process. What do you think? Let me ask you on this. What is pictured in 9 and 10? What is the form of punishment, right? So the prophet is announcing God's punishment over this process of latifundialization. How would you describe what the punishment is in general terms?
No children.
No children, okay. Yeah, the houses will be desolate.
Famine.
Famine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Drought. That's
Drought. Right? It's like a reversal of fortunes, right? You set up this system to maximize surplus and to become like Pharaoh, but your punishment is the natural forces of the world, if you will, sort of conspire against you. And you build these mansions, but they're left empty. You build these large estates, and yet there's famine and the produce doesn't come in. The imagery at the end with mentions of a bath and an ephah, let me kind of unpack that for you. Huge vineyards typically produce only one bath of, or in this case, it produces, these huge vineyards are producing one bath of wine. Now, a bath is about 6 gallons. As a point of reference, 1 acre of grapes in a normal circumstance can produce about 500 gallons of wine. So a 10-acre vineyard would produce about 5,000 gallons of wine, typically. God's punishment is your vineyard, your 10 acres is only going to produce 6 gallons. So it's this exponential decrease in productivity. It's like God is hitting the wealthy landowners where it hurts. They're all about surplus. Well, in this punishment, they don't get surplus, right? They produce only 6 gallons when they were expecting 5,000 gallons, right? And so God is sort of, in this imagery here, this reversal makes sense of the language that we saw earlier. The punishment is that God is going to remove the walls, remove the hedges of the field. That's not just a generic punishment for all of Israel. I think what the prophet is targeting is really sort of the deconstruction of these large estates. By removing the hedges, by removing the walls of the vineyard, I think what the prophet is imagining is this return back to the system of Nahalah, right? It's Larry's, for lack of a better term, Larry's estate gets broken up into small properties of land that are once again Nahalah for individuals. So it's a reversal of the economic system so as to empower once again these small scale subsistence farmers. And in that kind of reverse latifundialization, that's going to address the wealth gap. That's going to address the system of poverty as a social reality in the 8th century. So go back, read Amos, read Hosea, read Micah, read Isaiah, and you're going to see this theme of land and land access pop up again and again. Let me pause here just to see what sort of questions, comments, observations are bubbling to surface. Yeah, go ahead. And I'll stop my share so we can see each other a little bit better. Yeah, please.
What about this with the walls going up? That he's taken everything, plus there's nothing, there's no gleaning anymore. Because on the little thing, in the little plots, are they glean? I mean, you can glean on those.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
yeah.
Just a wonderful observation. So if the goal is surplus, you don't want to do things like not reap to the edge of your field. You don't want to let your field lie fallow every 7th year so the poor can eat from it. That does not work. If your goal is surplus and trade and maximizing luxury goods, all of the laws that we encountered last week are inconveniences that must be avoided. And I think you're right to signal that the creation of the walls is meant to keep out the poor who would have expected to come onto your property to glean. With the walls, they can't do that. So yeah, Charlie, go ahead.
There are all kinds of ways that people lose their possessions through death, through incompetence, through natural disasters, through lack of having heirs or such. So the prophet wants to give all these Nahalath back to the original owners, but what's to keep it from happening again? In other words, there's not a $1.6 billion, $1 trillion fund to help these people. So how does it work?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think part of the answer is that the prophet is calling the people back to the law, to the religious law, which tries to prevent the creation of these large estates in the first place. So that's one thing. Let's not recreate this. If it's not already there, let's not recreate these large estates in other parts of Israel. But I think the other thing it imagines is actually the breakup of the large estates, like the imagery of Isaiah 5, that these large estates become once again small bits of property. And that's going to require the wealthy landowner to break down those walls, or to have those walls broken down such that the small plots of land can come up again. Now, what we don't know, what we do partially know, is that though the prophets spoke out against these problems, the wealthy landowners didn't listen. In fact, the wealthy landowners saw the prophets as their enemies, right? That they were not on team prophet here. This was a threat to their economic base. And so this is where we begin to see this struggle within ancient Israel between the law and the prophets who represent the law, and Israelites who don't want to follow in that. So it's a major struggle within the prophetic text. That's why I'm highlighting that while there was an issue with Assyria, the external threat, the prophets understood that the biggest threat to Israel was internal to it.
Larry, so I would imagine that one of the incentives that big landowners might offer to someone to give up their Nahala would be I will hire you into my farm and pay you better wages than you can make off of your small plot of land. And once they've hired them, they'll cut their wages.
Yeah, that's a great insight. I'm sure that happened. I can't think of any biblical stories that name that, but that is very plausible to me that something like that happened.
So Ryan, this is Cherie Bryant. Good morning.
Good morning, Cherie.
I think this is really interesting because really a present day example of this is Hilton Head, South Carolina, where they have
right.
well, the ancestral slaves had property that they owned, but it really wasn't anything written in the law or anything. It was just an understanding that they would pass the land down to family generations, and the purpose was just for having land ownership, a place to live, really. But what has happened over the years is wealthy commercialization has set in. And so if you can get one person to sell their small part of land, then they just end up taking over, you're putting it all together and forming commercialization, basically tourism. And so now if you really look at it, a lot of the, I guess it would be considered nahalas, have been put together for these large golf kind of resorts and different things where they're using that basically for profit. And so there's really nothing they can do because there was nothing written in the law to protect them from it. It's just a matter of preying on one person for cash, really. And I saw a program about it a couple of weeks ago. It's kind of sad, actually, but I do feel like it's a present day example. Well,
I appreciate you naming that, Cherie, because this is one of those places where because our society is not agrarian in the same exact way. Our relationship to property is not the same as ancient Israel. There's a lot that's different between the then and there. So there's not an easy one-to-one, but like we talked about last week, we have to sort of move back from these ancient ideas to the principles and then think about how those principles translate to where we are today. So Cherie, I love that you are kind of taking that framework and saying, how does that help us understand what's happening in our world and what conclusions and ideas can we draw from it? So I think that's exactly the right impulse. Let me move us forward here just for the sake of time. Again, I might have mentioned this before, but one of my spiritual gifts in the world is to create 3-hour lessons for really what is about a 55-minute study. So I've done that once again this morning, but I want to go ahead and signal where the rest of this is headed, and we might continue part of what we don't get to next week. So this is just a sketch of the social reality. By the way, did that screen come through again? Great, okay. So this begins to give us a sense of the social reality of the 8th century prophets. Now, what I want to do is begin to think together about, so how did the prophets respond to this social reality? Well, part of it is self-evident in that they didn't like it. And so they responded in the ways of Isaiah 5, 1-7, right? They critique what is happening in the social world, bringing to bear the biblical witness or the law to the problem, the injustice they see in society. So we could just stop there, but I want to try to flesh that out a little bit. I want to get a little bit more specific in terms of how the prophets responded. What was the task in response to this sort of social reality? And I want to highlight 2 general tasks of the prophet, 2 general tasks. I think we could categorize most of what the prophets say, maybe not all, but most of what the prophets say into one of these 2 categories. The first category, and this is my language for this, is that the first task of the prophet is to puncture the pretense that everything is as it should be in the social economic world, to puncture the pretense that everything is as it should be. Now let's think about that for a second. Why is that so crucial? Why is that sort of the starting point for the prophetic witness, to puncture the pretense that everything is as it should be? Why is that so important? If that doesn't happen, what's the problem? What do y'all think about that?
There's no impetus for change if you don't show that everything isn't as it should be.
Yeah, that's right. Like, people don't rise up against that which they don't know is wrong. right? They need to be able to see the injustice to begin to respond to it. This is a sort of a pop culture reference, but at the very last line of The Usual Suspects, a great, was it late 80s, 90s film, Kevin Spacey says, "The greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world that he did not exist." The greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world that he did not exist. Well, we could, by analogy, we could say the same. The greatest trick or the greatest problem the prophets have to address is this belief that there isn't a problem to address in the first place, that somehow the creation of these large estates, that's just how it is. Like that's just how it works. Like there's no other possibility. Like things have to be that way. Well, part of the prophets is to point out that no, in fact, that doesn't have to be that way, and it shouldn't be that way. And here are the problems when the world is set up in this fashion. And prophets do this. They try to cut through the numbness and the self-deception that says this is just how things are. And we see this so often in the words of the prophets. I'm going to bring to focus one very familiar text from the prophets. You all know this line, right? From Amos 5:24, "But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." This biblical passage is popular. It's been popularized in many different fronts, not least of which is that Martin Luther King Jr. used this in his famous "I Had a Dream" speech. A side note on that speech, does anyone remember what the broader move, or he gave that speech as part of a march on Washington. Does anyone remember what that march was about?
Poverty.
We think it was about poverty. Yes, like we so much associate that walk in Martin Luther King's movement with racial injustice, and we should in many levels, but that was a march for jobs. It was about poverty. The context of that speech was economic, not racial injustice. Now, they're not mutually exclusive. Racism and economic injustice are very much intertwined. So I'm not saying that Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't talking about race and racism, but the context of that speech was the economy and poverty and jobs. So too is the same true here of Amos's words in 5:24. The context is a broader one of economics. And by the way, as a side note on this imagery, it's so wonderful. Let justice roll down like waters. I can imagine like a waterfall. Like I'm thinking of North Carolina waterfalls up near Highlands and that sort of imagery. Let righteousness flow like an ever-flowing stream. This is such vibrant imagery for ancient Israel, because remember, ancient Israel is a place that does not have flowing waters like this. Their water is very scarce in Israel. In fact, the major river, the Jordan, is buried deep beneath sea level, meaning that the Jordan, though a wonderful source of water, is not very usable when it comes to irrigation canals. This is the major difference between the Jordan River and the Nile. The Nile River, you could overflow it and you could use it for irrigation. Not so with the Jordan. So this idea of an ever-flowing stream was a source of life, and it would have been vivid to people living in this part of the world. But let's think about the words that come before this, right? And think about how it's trying to puncture the pretense that everything is as it should be. The prophet says, I despise your religious festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs, and I will not listen to the melody of your harps. You can imagine here the prophets speaking to, let's say, these wealthy landowners, and the wealthy landowners' defense is, I go to church every Sunday. I mean, they wouldn't have said that, but they might have said, well, I give my burnt offerings to the temple. I go to worship in Jerusalem. I'm there for all of the festivals. I'm there for all of the assemblies. I sing the prayers. I sing the psalms and I play the music. And they point to their religiosity as to say, look, I am faithful to God's law and to God's word, right? They have this defense, and the prophet tries to puncture that religious justification and says, no, that's not enough. And in fact, if you live economically a life of injustice, if you cut off these ever-flowing streams of justice and righteousness, then all of your religiosity is of no good to me. The prophet isn't saying that going to the temple and singing songs and praise, that's unimportant, full stop. It's saying that is not enough. That is empty and hollow without concrete acts of justice in the economic realm, right? So it's kind of puncturing the pretense that sort of religious piety gets one off the hook when it comes to these economic systems. Another example of it, all sticking with Amos, although we could turn to other prophets, is Amos 8:4-6. The prophet says, "Hear this, you that trample on the needy, and bring ruin to the poor of the land." So it's laying out the economic destruction. It's making it clear that this is happening, saying, now this is the quote that's going to follow is, "This is what the people say who are trampling the needy and bringing ruin to the poor. When will the new moon be over so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath so that we may offer wheat for sale?" When will we, so let me pause there. What this is imagining, the Sabbath and the new moon were festivals in which no buying and selling was to be done. But these people can't wait to get back to buying and selling, right? Because they have this surplus and their main goal is profit. Their main goal is to turn that surplus into profit. So they want to rush past the Sabbath. They want to rush past the new moon so they can get back to making profits off the land, right? That's their logic, right? He's mirroring what they would say inside. It continues, when will we make, we will make the ephah small and the shekel great. This is striking imagery. The ephah is a measure of volume, and the shekel was a payment, a form of payment. And so what it's imagining is when we're trading and making profit off our produce, and people are trading with us, we're going to make the ephah small and the shekel great, meaning we're going to charge a lot of money, but our scales are going to be false scales, right? We're not going to actually be giving we're going to be charging a higher price for a smaller amount of goods, and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat. That last line there is important, right? I think it's thinking back to that gleaning imagery, right? Where we are to not maximize profits over all of the parts of the land. We are supposed to leave some for the poor. Here, they're so desperate for surplus and profit that they take the sweepings of the wheat when you're harvesting it, and even that they sell for profit. The profit as FIT, the profits, PHET, the prophets are calling that desire for profit into question and saying, this is happening, friends. This is happening in the midst of our country. This isn't something the Assyrians are doing. This is something we are doing. And this needs to end, because by living this way, you are in effect trampling the needy. And that imagery of trampling the needy is evocative in its own right. You can actually think of, it's really quite troubling in light of the catastrophe in Israel from a couple of days ago, where people were actually trampled to death. You might have heard about that on the news at the big religious festival. But it has even more meaning in the ancient world, because going back to Pharaoh again, Pharaoh, one of Pharaoh's ways that he liked to depict himself was striding over defeated enemies. So if Pharaoh had just conquered the Philistines or someone like that, he would have a picture made of himself where he's literally trampling over the defeated enemies. In fact, so much so that Pharaoh had sandals made. One second, bud.
Ooh, is this my size?
That is, sweetie. Yeah.
Mine?
Pharaoh had sandals made where images of his. Hang on one second, buddy. I'll be there in just. It is, sweetie. I'll be there in just 2 minutes. Okay. Pharaoh had sandals made with images of his enemies on the inside sole, such that as Pharaoh walked around in his house, he could imagine himself trampling the sole or trampling his enemies even as he walked. Friends, I think the prophet is borrowing that imagery in saying, once again, in treating the poor this way, you are trampling the poor just as Pharaoh imagines himself trampling his enemies. It's once again this idea that in enacting this way, you are becoming little pharaohs. and you are doing to your people what Pharaoh once did to your whole nation. You know what it's like to be enslaved by Pharaoh. Don't do that to your people. It's language that I think would have cut through this superficial sense that everything is fine and this is how things should be. The prophets are trying to puncture the numbness created by this economic system and to bring to public witness the fact that something must change. Something must change. And friends, I think if I can just have, I'll finish up here just 2 minutes. If this is one task of the church today, to puncture the pretense that everything is fine in our country economically, right? And part of that is education. Part of it is helping people to become aware of the economic realities in our world. Now, in 2 minutes, I'm not going to do that for you, but I just want to kind of just give some stats, right? These are things that I think most church members, now maybe you excluded, but many people in churches are utterly unaware of. In America, the top 20% of people have 85% of the wealth. Think of that wealth gap and the disparity. 43 million people in America today are under the poverty line. Guess what the poverty line is for a family of 4? It's $26,000. What that means, friends, is that if you're a family of 4 and you make $27,000, you're not considered poor. Where could you live in America with a family of 4 on $27,000? Not Atlanta. 1 in 2 Americans spend more than 1 year of their life within 200% of the poverty line. Meaning that, so to use these stats, 1 in 2 Americans spend more than 1 year under $52,000. Now, $52,000 is a lot more than 26, but again, I would ask, where in America can you afford to live with a family of 4, medical costs, car, all the sorts of things for $52,000? You might be able to do it, but you are economically vulnerable. You are one disaster, one car accident, one injury away, one lost job away from quickly dropping beneath the poverty line. The Georgia minimum wage, friends, is $5.15 an hour. Now that's overruled in some cases by the federal minimum wage, which is a little bit higher. The Atlanta poverty wage, meaning this is, if you make less than this, you will be beneath the poverty line. The Atlanta poverty wage is $6.30. So what this means, friends, is that if you make the Georgia minimum wage, you will be beneath the poverty line. Because to be above the poverty line, you have to make more than $6.30. The Atlanta, what is a living wage? Any guesses? And we'll get you out of here on this. What is the Atlanta living wage? Meaning if you make this, you won't be beneath the poverty line and you'll have just a tiny bit of margin. I don't mean like a vacation home in the mountains, but you have just a tiny bit of margins for things like going out to eat every once in a while. Or paying for a babysitter every once in a while. What do you need to make? What's the living wage in Atlanta? Any guesses?
40,000?
You're close, but this is in per hour, and I can't do the math in my head quickly enough. It's $21 an hour. Wow! So think about that. The Georgia minimum wage is 4 times lower than what one would actually have to make to have even the smallest bit of economic surplus. And again, I don't mean big 403k plan or mountain house. I mean, just like you can go out to eat once a week, or you can pay for a summer camp for your kid, that sort of things. Friends, I don't have easy solutions for any of this morning. I have some ideas and we can get to some of that. But what I want to signal is that part of the responsibility of the church is to join the prophets in puncturing the pretense that everything is as it should be economically. It's a complicated economic system. We ought not to pretend that the solutions are easy or anything like that. But this is part of the prophetic task. Now, what I want to do next week, and I think we're going to start here, friends, is next week, there's a second prophetic task. It's not just pointing out the problems. The prophets also embody something more constructive with respect to imagining a new way, a new economic reality. And so next week, I want to begin there as a way of finishing up this consideration of the poverty in the prophets. And then we're going to shift from the prophets to the Psalms. The Psalms is not the typical place we turn to think about economics and poverty in Scripture, but there's some really important things happening in the Psalms that we need to understand that's going to shed further light on this broader topic. So friends, I've held you too long for that. I am sorry. I'm going to hang out for another 10 minutes. We are officially done. If you need to move on to worship or other things, no problem. Be well. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week, hopefully. If you want to stay and chat for a few more minutes, again, I'm happy to do so, and we can have that conversation informally. Friends, thank you so much. I enjoyed our conversation. Sorry again for once again for planning 3 times more the material than we actually have time for.
Thank you, Ryan. Oh, fantastic.
Thank you all.
Yes.
So Ryan, you know, there was a meme going around that about employers complaining that they can't get their employees back because they make more on unemployment than they would working. And then the question becomes, why are you paying your employees so little that would be the case?
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. You saw a lot of parallels. You think about in Israel, the building of the walls to wall out the Palestinians. And it's like, think about that, people. And then, of course, we're building walls. Think about that, people.
Yep. Absolutely right, Velma.
Ryan, it seems to me that we have a big problem in the church. And I know this because we've had it recently in our church. And that is, if you begin to make noises about the situation as it occurs, people really get upset and say, oh, it's not the church's place to be political.
That's right.
They immediately, of course, I personally happen to think that Jesus Christ was a primarily political person in his way of looking at the world. He talked about the kingdom on earth, but people don't want you to do that in the church.
Yeah, that we're in a really hard spot with that now. And I think there's a couple things that are making these conversations difficult. One is that we've confused politics and partisanship. The gospel is inherently political. I mean, even the terms like Lord and Savior, actually, they were terms applied to Caesar. I mean, Jesus is reappropriating political terms to frame his whole ministry. The gospel is unavoidably political. In that it affects public and civil life. It seeks to transform public and civil life, in addition to spirituality. But we've confused politics with partisanship. And partisanship, as in like Democrat or Republican, it's so toxic in our world today that I get the impulse to not want to be partisan in a church context, but I think we've overcorrected. Many churches have overcorrected and say, well, we can't talk about anything political. Well, friends, if we can't talk about anything political, then we really can't talk about the gospel, or at least not much of it, other than how to get people to heaven and how do you save them from hell. And that's not actually where Jesus's focus is, not because he doesn't say anything about that. But remember, the Bible says way more about money and poverty than it does about heaven and hell. So that's the first thing. The second problem I think we're in is that in America today, I think politics is now upstream of religion. And what I mean by that is someone's like partisan orientation is the primary factor in their life, and religion is downstream from that. Religion is derivative of that. And that's never how things were supposed to be. Religion and our faith commitments were always to be upstream of our politics. Now, ideally, that means that our faith traditions informs our politics, but it also means that faith can exist in a way that critiques our politics, critiques Democrats, critiques Republican, but but because we have politics upstream of religion now, that can't happen. And in fact, it's politics that informs our religious commitments, not the other way around. And I don't know how to reverse that trend, or I have some ideas, but it is hard work to reverse that trend of politics being upstream from religion. That was a way too long answer for your thoughtful question.
But such a good answer. Thank you.
It is.
Other questions, comments, insights are bubbling to the surface for you as we engage this.
Ryan, the way I was going earlier, I wondered why the prophets or why the Israelites didn't have a total response. Why, I guess that their government didn't come together and take care of those Nahalas that needed help when they needed, because obviously it was like a checkerboard of lights coming on. Everybody needed help at some point.
Yeah.
Part of the culture of the Israelites.
Yeah, the only thing I can say about it's a great point is that the kings very often in ancient Israel were allied with the wealthy and the people owning the real estate. I mean, think back to that story I relayed very briefly about 1 Kings 21. Ahab the king was part of the problem. He was creating the large estates. And so this is one major difference, by the way, between Israelite prophets and most of the prophets from Mesopotamia, because, you know, there were prophets there wasn't an Israelite unique phenomena. There were prophets in the ancient world in Mesopotamia, but the prophets in ancient Assyria, Babylon, they were supporters of the king. And they were sort of yes men for the king. So the king would come to the prophet in Mesopotamia and say, well, you know, am I going to win this battle? Should I go and overtake this land? And the prophets would say, yes. And let me show you here. Let's look at the entrails of a cow, and this shows that you're going to win the battle, right? They support the ambitions of the king. In the biblical tradition, the prophets are almost always at odds with the king. The prophets are the corrective to the king. The prophets are calling the king back to justice, whether it's Elijah who combats Ahab, or it's Nathan confronting David. There are so many examples where the prophets are the counterweights to the king, and that's dangerous business. So all that's to say is that the kings socially and economically were part of the problem. Now, should they have been part of the solution? Absolutely. But that didn't seem to happen much at all in the ancient world. There's only one or two kings that seem to go in the opposite direction. Hezekiah and Josiah being those two kings.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions before we draw this to a close?
Brian, I think this is Reynolds. I think sometimes we think the things are too complicated. They're just too out of our hands, that we can't do anything about it. And so we become complacent. But I think it's the church's role to tell us that we can do something about it and that we should do something about it. And if we think about it hard enough, you know, little things become big things. Yes. I mean, what you do in a small way can become a very big thing if enough people do it. And,
amen.
Yeah, so I think that's the one role the church needs to play in prophetic kinds of ways.
Yeah, you're so right. And that's a beautiful segue to what we'll start with next week, because the second prophetic task is to really present an empowering vision of how things can be different. Their task is to help us believe that things can be different and that we can play a role, even if the problem is big, that communities can make a difference. That's part of the prophetic task. And I think it's one we forget in our modern world. The prophetic idea is often just like wagging a finger at what's wrong, but the prophets had a much more constructive role to play, because in order for things to change, yes, we need to see that they're wrong, but we each need to be mobilized and empowered to bring about change at a local level. And that's sort of where I started with the law, is that this change that the prophets see happening, it's at a local level. It's not at an individual level, just individual acts of charity, but it's at a local level. Things can change locally. And that's where I am absolutely convinced that churches like Trinity Pres or many others, you can make a difference in Atlanta. Now, maybe Trinity Pres is not going to change, the national definition of poverty. I don't know, maybe it can, maybe through advocacy and influence it can, I don't know. But I know that Trinity Pres can make a difference in Atlanta when it comes to Atlanta specific problems of homelessness, affordable housing, and all of the things related to economic injustice. And that's where I've been talking to Bright about this, but that's where I want this course to leave you with. I want this course to give you the biblical and theological frameworks to begin and rethink Trinity's role and mission with respect to economic injustice. Now, there could be a follow-up course and discussions and things we could do to drill more down into, okay, well, actually, how do we do that? Now that we are equipped with these biblical and theological principles, how do we actually reimagine our response to poverty? I hope this course gets us there. And then I hope you all want to continue those conversations. And I'm happy to help orient that and be involved in any way that would be helpful to you all in those follow-up conversations.